Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you, Jasper, for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to speak in connection with this exhibition. It's terrific to be in Vienna. It's my first time, but it's especially terrific to be here to see this amazing exhibition. And if you haven't seen it yet, please take advantage of this kind of private moment you can have with it after this talk. It's a beautiful overview of his work. It's especially wonderful for me to help celebrate Joseph Cornell's triumphant journey to Europe. As an American who seldom strayed more than a few miles from home, Cornell never visited London or Paris or Vienna. That is, he never visited in person. He had a rich fantasy life that often included imaginings about 19th century European ballerinas, fairy tales, and books. And he frequently titled his works in French to seem more worldly. I think he would be delighted to know that his work is being seen by a European audience. It would be especially wonderful for him, I think, to know that his work is on view at this museum, so rightly famous for its wonderful Kunstkammer. It's intriguing to think about Cornell's work within the larger context of collecting and assembling objects that resulted in such fascinating collections as the one in this museum. What I'd like to do this evening is share some thoughts about the relationship between the work of the American, Cornell, and 16th and 17th century European phenomena of the Curiosity Cabinet, or Wunderkammer. My ideas grow out of a project that I'm working on about Cornell and natural history. As we'll see, there are very interesting parallels between Cornell's work and curiosity cabinets of the past. And initially, I thought that would be the focus of my lecture. Whoops, I leaned on something that I shouldn't have been. Okay, let's get back to wherever we're supposed to be. That's where we're supposed to be. But as I went deeper into the topic, I realized that there are also some problems when we try to link Cornell directly to this earlier tradition. In recent years, Cornell's fascination with collecting containers filled with odd, often incongruous combinations of things has led to frequent comparisons between his work and the tradition of the Wunderkammer and Curiosity Cabinet, seen, for instance, on the Wunderkammer page on Pinterest that we see here. In this reference to Cornell's Cabinets of Wonder in a review of a 2007 exhibition in San Francisco, and even in the mention of his Cabinets of Curiosities in a review published last summer when this exhibition was at the Royal Academy, and even in my original title for this talk. And these comparisons make sense, as we'll see, because Cornell's boxes have obvious counterparts in earlier curiosity cabinets. But there are also more complicated aspects of this parallelism that raise complex questions about Cornell's creative process. Cornell's was an art of containing and collecting, where objects and associations are carefully packed into small boxes, often subdivided into inner compartments, drawers, trays, and even hanging or moving parts. Many things could be containers, books that open to reveal hidden contents, small suitcases reminiscent of Marcel Duchamp's boîte en valise, even tiny cardboard pillboxes containing even tinier insects and portraits. But his format of choice, and the one that he is best known for, is the shallow box, often divided into gridded compartments and filled with odd assortments of things. If we compare this box on the left to one that we see here in a 17th century painting of a curiosity cabinet that Cornell knew in passing. It was included in an article that he kept in one of his files. It's easy to see why Cornell's art is compared to this earlier tradition. There's obviously a superficial resemblance. But how far can we go beyond this visual similarity? I believe we need to question whether Cornell was really building on this tradition, and if so, how, and to what extent it shaped his work. I'll argue that rather than actual examples like this one, there are three aspects of the Curiosity Cabinet that were essential for Cornell. Its role as a byproduct in the age of discovery in the 16th and 17th centuries, its importance as a pre-Enlightenment precursor to natural history museums founded in the 19th century, and its strange interconnections with French surrealism of the 1920s and 30s. These factors, we'll see, I think, led to Cornell's absorption of the spirit, if not the fact, of the Wunderkammer in his work. I'd like to take a moment to clarify some terminology and provide some background. A curiosity cabinet, or a Wunderkammer, a wonder room, could be a room or a series of rooms like the one we see in this early print. Displayed would be wonders of nature. Crocodiles frequently hung from ceilings, and stuffed birds were popular, as well as man-made creations of beautiful works of art and technical ingenuity. A curiosity cabinet could also be a piece of furniture, a cabinet or cupboard, with drawers and often sometimes secret storage compartments intended as a whole room in miniature. Some curiosity cabinets were assembled as tangible proof of the wealth and power of a princely collector. And as a mode of imperial self-representation, they were intended to intimidate as much as to educate a visitor. Other collections, like this one we see, were assembled by scholars to understand the world through its myriad marvels. This is the collection of the Danish physician Ole Worm. For collectors like these, an encyclopedic collection signified the attainment of global knowledge. In either case, such collections were designed as microcosms of all creation, with blurred boundaries between the separate Aristotelian categories of nature and art. In 1565, the Flemish scholar Samuel Kiesberg described a Wunderkammer, in his words, as a theater of the broadest scope, containing authentic materials and precise reproductions of the whole of the universe, unquote. While collections like that of Ole Worm today look like bizarre mixtures of diverse items, modern scholars have shown that there were complex systems of associations, analogies, and resemblances based on a search for unity among all creation, but also overlaid on these attempts to show the whole of the universe was a general sense of wonder. This institutionalization of collecting the marvels of the universe was, of course, a byproduct of the age of discovery, when 16th and 17th century explorers were returning from new worlds with objects as tangible proof of distant and marvelous lands. We can use this painting of an imaginary princely Wunderkammer to show how notions of encyclopedic collecting intersected with the idea of discovery during this period. Of course, this is a complex painting with many other levels of interpretation, but for our purposes, I want to use it as an example of an imaginary collection in the age of discovery. Not surprisingly, many collections included paintings or models of the kind of sailing ships that transported the stuff of the New World back to the Old. When these imported exotic objects were exhibited, their original context was generally irrelevant. Their meaning came instead from their role as symbols of European power, their strangeness when taken out of context, and their position within a perceived cosmic order. Collections were often thought of as comprising naturalia and artificialia. Naturalia were items from the natural world. During this time of exploration and conquest, these might be an exotic shell, a piece of coral, a coconut, an ostrich egg, a stuffed parrot or a crocodile, and botanical specimens. Many of these objects also fell into the category of mirabilia, or marvels of the world. In addition to naturalia, collections included artificialia, or human-made objects. These were works of art, ancient and modern, demonstrating human artistic achievement and the wonders of human artifice. Scientifica included technological devices, tools such as mathematical objects, telescopes, and clocks, as well as globes and armillary spheres that mapped the newly expanding understanding of the earth and the heavens. Thus, the whole universe was compressed into miniature form in real or imagined curiosity cabinets that provided vast networks of meaning and correspondences for natural and man-made marvels. Later, during the Enlightenment, the eclectic collecting spirit of the Wunderkammer would evolve into two distinct institutions: the Museum of Art, as we know it today, which focuses on the aesthetic value of human production, and the Museum of Natural History, that places natural specimens in intellectual and geographical contexts. Scholars such as Carl Linnaeus would establish systems for understanding and classifying difference. But until that point, the desire to condense, encapsulate, and unify the wonders of natural and human creation led to collections like this painted one that celebrated, to use Francis Bacon's words, the shuffle of things. The visual and conceptual parallels between the Wunderkammer and the work of Joseph Cornell are striking. From tiny seashells and pictures of insects to charts of the deep reaches of outer space, the objects he used touch on a dizzying variety of personal interests reflected in a wide array of materials. As a side note, I should say, he seldom titled his works at the time of their making, so they're often called untitled. But in his notes and other lists, he assigned titles to them after the fact. So if a work isn't signed physically on the piece, the convention is to call the work untitled and then use his informal titles in parentheses. The materials he placed in his box constructions often have direct parallels to the contents of curiosity cabinets. He filled boxes with stuffed parrots or pictures of them mounted on wood, and included naturalia and artificialia, like dried leaves. You can see the dried leaves near the bottom of the box. And a picture of a butterfly. You can just see the wing of it on the hanging cylinder at the top, as well as a tiny star map in the lower left corner of the constellation Ursa Major. He made boxes with Dutch clay pipes blowing bubbles of pictures of seashells. He used reproductions of past works of art, recalling the inclusion of artworks in curiosity cabinets. This box also has naturalia in the form of wooden cubes with pictures of birds and plants pasted on them near the lower part of the box in a horizontal line. Below them is a feather and a fan housed in a drawer like a precious specimen, reminding us of the odd groupings of materials in earlier collections. He was keenly interested in the concept of navigation, both by humans and by birds, and he assembled enigmatic boxes of compasses and clipped articles about how birds find their way through the night sky. He even made mystical lake collages on the theme of interplanetary navigation. Cornell was a collector. His creative process revolved around finding objects that could somehow relate to subjects. Those relationships were personal, often indecipherable, and always strange. In 1941, he converted the basement of the house on Utopia Parkway that he shared with his mother and invalid brother into a studio and archive. He called it, in his words, at once a workshop, bulletin board, repository, and gallery, unquote. Here he could work without interruption, surrounded by cartons of materials he collected. If we look at photographs of his workspace through the lens of the Wunderkammer, the similarities make one stop. Whitewashed boxes with blue painted labels lead us to things like seashells in the upper right corner. He had boxes labeled habitat birds, tinfoil, owl cutouts, Albrecht-Dürer, watch parts, and glasses, just to name a few. Inside the boxes were green parrots, brightly colored feathers, paper painted to look like beautiful marble, like the marble we're surrounded by here, and compasses. Just the sort of items that would have appealed to a 17th century collector, although for very different reasons. In the lower left foreground of this photograph, you see a large stack of folders and envelopes, right over there, containing some of Cornell's source files. This was a vast compendium spread throughout his entire house of clippings from books, newspapers, and magazines, covering a wide array of topics. For Cornell, his clipping files constituted a kind of curiosity collection in the age of mechanical reproduction. Files covered topics like astronomy, with pictures and texts extending from the history of astronomy and celestial mapping to current discoveries in astrophysics. Cornell had files about seashells, birds, minerals, and movie stars, Albrecht-Dürer, the history of ballet. The list goes on and on. Some of these collections of materials were what he called dossiers, containing a mixture of seemingly unrelated items in folders or boxes that somehow made sense to him. He added to these dossier collections throughout his life, indicating that his interests were far-flung and long-lasting. In this respect, he paralleled the famous collectors of the 16th and 17th centuries, who devised their own systems of analogies and correspondences to organize their vast and unwieldy collections of natural and human-made materials. Of course, there is an important difference. A collection of curiosities, like that of Ole Worm, was an end in itself, a quasi-encyclopedic array of wonderful, quite literally, objects meant to instruct and delight. Cornell's collections, on the other hand, were meant to provide objects and inspiration for his art. They were an artist's working materials to be used, discarded, or transformed as needed, not exotic or magical treasures brought back by sailing ships that circumnavigated the globe. How can we position Cornell within the context of the Wunderkammer? Let's compare two examples. First, let's begin with a trompe-l'oeil painting of a curiosity cabinet attributed to the Flemish painter Domenico Remps. Here we have many of the items we associate with the curiosity cabinet. On the outer doors are paintings of sailing ship and coral. An inner glass-fronted compartment is filled with the wonders of the world. On the bottom shelf are insects, shells, more coral. There are works of art in the cabinet, and a mirror and a glass natural philosophy object hang from the inner top on the right. There are vanitas, references like the watch and balanced knife at the base. And if you look carefully, you can see that the panes of glass in this painted curiosity cabinet are sometimes broken. Placing these objects in a larger vanitas tradition, a spiritual context about the fleetingness of life. If we compare the cabinet pictured in the painting to Cornell's first important box construction, the soap bubble set of 1936, it's tempting to see a direct line of influence. Cornell's box is also glass-fronted. The soap bubble had long vanitas associations that Cornell was aware of. Works of art are alluded to in the collage elements on the hanging cylinders in the upper corners. The egg in the wine glass is reminiscent of natural specimens in earlier cabinets. The doll's head on a pedestal recalls ancient sculptures that were found in Wunderkammern. And the 19th century map of the moon in the background parallels the celestial globes and charts found in earlier collections. However, there is a serious problem in making comparisons like these, which imply that Cornell was aware of and conversant with the appearance, history, and meanings of these collections. I don't think he was. In fact, as far as I can tell, during his lifetime, he was born in 1903 and died in 1972, very few non-specialists knew much of anything about them. In 1908, a curator at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, Julius von Schlosser, published a seminal scholarly study on Wunderkammer in German, a language Cornell did not know. In the early 1980s, a decade after Cornell's death, there was an explosion of interest in curiosity cabinets, especially in conjunction with the 300th anniversary of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. However, between 1908 and the early 1980s, there was virtually no popular literature published on the curiosity cabinet. During Cornell's lifetime, the term Wunderkammer appeared only once in the Christian Science Monitor a newspaper he read daily. Moreover, in Cornell's lifetime, the word Wunderkammer appeared only twice in the New York Times, another of his favorite newspapers. Once in this article, published in 1950, about the cabinet of Rudolf II at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and then again only the year before Cornell died. The terms curiosity cabinet or cabinet of curiosities did not appear at all in either newspaper. I'm using these data mining word searches to see if there was a general knowledge about these terms and ideas that Cornell could have drawn on, but I haven't been able to find any evidence of it. A careful look through Cornell's voluminous clipping files does yield some possible links between his art and the curiosity cabinet. The most important and intriguing document in his papers was an article that Cornell saved from the 1938 Christmas issue of the Illustrated London News. The topic was trompe-l'oeil painting, and among the illustrations was the painting we've already seen by Georg Heinz of what the caption described as a cabinet de curie. Note that in 1938, there was no English term to use, so the French term was substituted. The article included just one sentence describing the jumble of items to be found in the painting, with no attempt to place the curiosity cabinet in any historical context. Interestingly, the caption described the painting as, quote, strangely reminiscent of the work of some surrealist painters, notably Salvador Dali. We know Cornell looked carefully at the article because he actually trimmed out the compartment with the seashells. See that little black void is actually where he trimmed the paper. This is from his papers in the Archives of American Art, which are online only in black and white. That's why there's that discrepancy. He trimmed those seashells. So maybe this article, with its surrealist stamp of approval, was enough to get Cornell thinking about how he might update this kind of thing. The last page of the article included a photograph of a trompe-l'oeil painting hanging on the wall of a modern interior. Although unidentified, clearly it's the painting now attributed to Domenico Rems. The caption notes that it was featured in a room arranged for the 1936 Grand Palais exhibition in Paris. But since Cornell never visited France, he could not have seen it there. But the article appeared in 1938, already 2 years after he exhibited his first important box construction, the soap bubble set of 1936, with its interesting parallels to the Cabinet of Curiosity. Perhaps the article, with its 2 reproductions of trompe-l'oeil paintings and 1 sentence that describes the eclectic objects organized into curiosity cabinets, encouraged him to continue working along these lines. But my sense is that he had already codified the assemblage box style that would sustain him for the rest of his career. Moreover, the article was just a few pages among the literally thousands of articles that he saved. And on its own, it's unlikely that it represents the kind of deep-seated and abiding interest that led to his life's work. Much as we might like to position Cornell and his work within the tradition of the Curiosity Cabinet, and yes, the similarities make us wonder, it's doubtful that he looked back to actual examples or that he patterned his creative process specifically on the earlier tradition. since there were hardly any books, exhibitions, or articles that he could have consulted for information or illustrations. So, how do we explain these parallels in his work? Rather than looking directly to the Cabinet of Curiosities to explain the obvious seeming parallels, I think we need to think about the age of discovery more broadly. In particular, we should consider Cornell's nostalgic interest in the age of sailing ships and his fascination with navigation and exploration. Here, I believe, we can find a conceptual link between the spirit of the Wunderkammer and his work. Throughout Cornell's career, he pictured travel. Descended from a Dutch seafaring family that was in America by the 18th century, he identified with ships that sailed from the old world to the new. In this surreal early collage, inspired by Max Ernst, he transformed an old-fashioned schooner into a giant rose with a spider rigging its web at the center. Perhaps making a pun on the term compass rose or wind rose, the symbol used on navigation charts to show the cardinal direction points. A decade later, with Ernst's collage style set firmly aside, he created a series of boxes on the theme of sailors' chests and navigation. Rose des Vents, or Rose of the Winds, is a good example. On the inner lid of the box is a map of the south coast of Australia. And inside the box is a tray filled with small compasses. Beneath the tray are compartments with shells and insects, maps and star charts, as well as fish, stones, and strange devices, all items that a sailing ship in the Age of Discovery might have brought back to Europe from the South Pacific. The hidden nature of these objects parallels the hidden materials sometimes kept in curiosity cabinets. In both cases, the interactive process of lifting the lid and finding the objects in their compartments also provides a physical metaphor for the act of discovery. The viewer participates in discovery. Other works refer directly to the riches from America brought back by 17th century explorers. In this strange little box containing tiny glass jars of a type Cornell called bottle museums, bottles contain New World treasures, colorful feathers, bits of silver and gold glitter, a brightly colored butterfly, while the text on the box's lid mentions a Venetian map, Mayan feathers, referring to the Maya civilization of South America, and the golden temple of Dobaiba, Conquistador, those are his words on the lid, a reference to the golden temple sought by the explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Like the earlier repositories of New World treasures, Cornell's museum presents a monument to an expanding world, although tinged with nostalgia for an earlier time. Other boxes focus on the realities of travel in the 17th century. He filled this one with sand, shells, rolling balls, and a map to envision the trade winds, calling to mind old ways of navigating to the South Seas. Even in the late 1950s, Cornell was still fascinated by connections between the 17th century explorers of the New World and his own times. One of his soap bubble sets includes a Ptolemaic map of the world on the inner back of the box, paired with a modern chart of the double star Algol, clipped from a current astronomy book. That's the red little ball coming out, seemingly, from the pipe on the left-hand side. He also covered the outer back of the box with text and pictures. At the lower left corner, he glued a text that reads, "When navigators of the great age of discovery set out to explore unknown seas, their picture of the world was close to the one given in this map, which appeared in a Venetian geography of 1561, and the rest of the text is obscured." Cornell may have been especially interested in the former age of discovery as a parallel to his own era. He was fascinated by current developments in the science of astrophysics. Many of his box constructions, like the one we see here in this article from Life magazine, combine nostalgia. Here we have an old piece of driftwood, and the back and sides of the box have been purposefully weathered. Nostalgia with modern charts of the cosmos, such as this chart showing the orbits of the planets around the sun. He made other works titled Radar Astronomy, Weather Satellites, and The Birth of the Nuclear Atom. Cornell knew that he, too, lived in a great age of discovery, in which not just the Earth, but the entire expanding universe was being mapped and explored. Just as the cabinets of Curiosities were thought to be theaters of the world, remember Kiescherberg's description of the Wunderkammer as precise reproductions of the whole of the universe. Cornell's boxes were microcosms of the modern expanding universe. Thus, the age of discovery and its past and present significance for Cornell offers one way the spirit of the Wunderkammer could have infused his work. Another way the legacy of the Curiosity Cabinet proved to be essential for Cornell was as a precursor to 19th century natural history museums. During the 18th century, the notion of amassing encyclopedic collections that could be mirrors of the entire world gave way to a desire to categorize and compartmentalize knowledge. In place of the Curiosity Cabinet's emphasis on the unity of all things, the guiding principle became the identification of diversified species and characteristics. Now birds were displayed with other birds, shells with other shells, so comparisons and differences could be noted. We see this in a transitional Curiosity Cabinet, the collection of Joseph Aubonnier de la Mosson from the 1740s. Part of it made its way to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where it can be seen today. The shells are all together on the lower left. The minerals are on the top left shelf. And we can compare different types of birds to one another at the right. As the science of natural history and the acceptance of Darwin's ideas spread throughout the 19th century, this interest in studying difference among species, fossils, minerals, etc., and the importance of context, things like species habitats and fossil locations, was reflected in the way collected specimens were displayed. It can also be seen in Cornell's work, especially in his box constructions featuring birds. In the 1940s, he embarked on a series of boxes he called aviaries. Some of these were reminiscent of Victorian collections of taxidermy birds, housed under large glass globes, found in natural history museums and even in the parlors of fancy homes. Under this globe is a profusion of stuffed American songbirds, paralleled in the birds and branches of Cornell's assemblage. In keeping with natural history terminology, Cornell made a subset of natural history boxes called habitats, in which he showed specimens in quasi-natural settings, like this owl in a box lined with bark and other plant matter. He recorded his thoughts about using these natural materials, describing himself, in his words, as working like an herbalist or apothecary of old with those sweet scents, unquote. Some of the owl boxes even had electric lights built into them to create the eerie glow of a moonlit night, as we see here. By Cornell's time, the institution of the Natural History Museum was firmly established, and although he never visited a 17th century curiosity cabinet and probably knew next to nothing about them, he made frequent visits to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He may have been exposed to the museum as a child, as part of their program of having school groups come to the museum. Or he may have seen traveling displays that the museum brought to local schools. I love this photograph, I had to include it. The museum took its educational mission very seriously, and it prepared special circulating natural study boxes, which Cornell may have seen as an adult. The parallels are remarkable. This traveling study collection, titled Birds That Are Our Friends, with birds, including an owl, was equipped with artificial lighting, offering a precedent for Cornell's later owl habitat boxes. And you can see the light on the top and the cord where you would plug in the light. Other traveling collections featured butterflies, another subject for Cornell's habitats. The Museum of Natural History's preferred mode of display was to place specimens in large glass vitrines, boxes that encased natural wonders. Glass boxes, windows, birds, owls, butterflies, all these intersect with Cornell's interests and creative process. Indeed, it seems far more likely that the idea of creating glass-fronted boxes with birds and butterflies occurred to Cornell from his frequent visits to the American Museum of Natural History, rather than from one obscure article in his clipping files that pictured a painting of a curiosity cabinet. This is not to say that Cornell was not influenced by the tradition of the curiosity cabinet. In a way, he was, but I believe it was through its legacies, as a reflection of the age of discovery and as a precursor to modern museums of natural history. There's one other legacy of the Cabinet of Curiosity, perhaps the most important one to consider when we think about Cornell's creative process with its delight in strange juxtapositions, especially those that merged the facts of science with the fantasy of the dream. This was European surrealism, especially the surrealist reliance on the marvelous as a foil to logic in the modern world. From the beginnings of his career as an artist, Cornell was aware of the opportunities science provided for someone interested in strange, uncanny, and dreamlike images. Publicly exhibiting alongside other surrealists in Julian Levy's gallery in 1932, Cornell showed tiny bell jars. This one is in the exhibition. This one has a horse and rider, seemingly balanced on a red plinth, as though in a dream. Fanciful though as it might seem, the picture was actually clipped from a popular 19th century school book on natural philosophy. It explained the principle of center of gravity and how bodies can be held in a state of stable equilibrium. But rather than presenting a science lesson, Cornell transformed the illustration into a strange little object that belongs to the realm of the dream. Cornell had an important model in the early work of Max Ernst, especially Ernst's collage novel, La Femme sans tête, of 1929, which Cornell knew well. Cornell also was no doubt familiar with another Ernst series, Histoire naturelle, Natural History, published in 1926. Cornell admired Ernst, and in the 30s produced a series of collages dedicated to him, featuring the birds, butterflies, and shells that would become ubiquitous in his later work. Illogical combinations of subjects and shifts in scale distanced these irrational object images from their sources in books about the physical world, and at this point placed Cornell, I think, quite firmly in the orbit of surrealism. But oddly enough, it also brought Cornell closer to the spirit of the Curiosity Cabinet, with its strange and seemingly illogical juxtaposition of objects and ideas. It's important to remember that the scant bits of information available to Cornell during Cornell's lifetime emphasized the helter-skelter, the jumbled nature of earlier collections. To distance his own work from the collages of Ernst, in the 1930s, Cornell found different ways to recast the logical world of modern science into illogical terms. In 1936, he exhibited a box filled with small glass containers called Cabinet of Natural History, Object. He showed it at the Museum of Modern Art in the fantastic Art Dada Surrealist exhibition that also included a glass vitrine that Cornell titled Elements of Natural Philosophy. The vitrine included not only the Cabinet of Natural History Object, but the 1936 soap bubble set that we looked at earlier, and you can see them in this photograph on the right. When we remove the bottles from their cabinet, we can see that they are indeed filled with strange things. One bottle is labeled instrument optique, or optical instrument, while another with feathers is identified as température des oiseaux hibernants, or the temperature of hibernating birds. A bottle with dark gray powder purportedly contains dust from a falling star gathered by the poet Edgar Allan Poe on a ship in 1827. And one bottle with pieces of glass is called Méthode de Monsieur Duchamp, a pun on the name of Cornell's friend Marcel Duchamp. This mingling of natural history and surrealist incongruous juxtaposition offers another connecting link between Cornell and the Curiosity Cabinet. One of the hallmarks of the Curiosity Cabinet was the emphasis on wonder as a defining principle, so that seemingly unrelated objects bump up against each other in ways that, to modern eyes, seem wonderfully delightful. This also happened in the Curiosity Cabinet. This idea of incongruous juxtaposition was an important aspect of Surrealism, especially as codified by the leader of the Surrealists in Paris, André Breton. Although Cornell sometimes denied his connections to the Surrealist movement, throughout his career he remained steadfastly interested in Surrealist art. He knew Breton in the early 1940s when the Frenchman was in exile in New York. Breton admired Cornell's work, and Cornell commented in his notes about Breton into the 1960s when he made several collages with portraits of him, like this one. Like other Surrealist artists and writers, Cornell saw vast creative potential in the concept of chance encounters of objects, like the Surrealist favorite chance encounter between an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table, described by the proto-symbolist poet known as Le Comte de Lautréamont. Cornell wrote in his diary notes about moments of what he called sublime ethereality. These moments came when objects would suddenly become interrelated to him. He clearly paid homage to Lautréamont's chance encounters in this collage, which was exhibited in the International Exposition of Surrealism in Paris in 1938, an exhibition curated by Breton. Which brings us back to the Wunderkammer. Several recent scholars have noted parallels between Breton's art and life and earlier times when collectors represented the marvels of the world in their curiosity cabinets. Like Cornell's home on Utopia Parkway, Breton's Parisian apartment was his home, study, and personal museum. A friend of his described it as a cross between the dusty office of a naturalist and the disordered storeroom of an ethnographic museum. But what Breton's collection of modern art and anthropological marvels recalls more than anything are 17th century cabinets of curiosities, with their attempts to represent the whole of the world in miniature. Breton could have seen the Curiosity Cabinet painting by Rems when it was exhibited at the Grand Palais in 1936. He could have visited the Jardin des Plantes and seen the cabinet of Bonnier de la Mosson. And he certainly visited the Trocadero Museum of Ethnography in Paris before its closure in 1937, where objects taken from French colonies were exhibited in jumbled collections that lacked the clear organization of New York's Museum of Natural History. In other words, far more than Cornell, Breton could have been familiar with some of the ideas that lay behind the Wunderkammer. Whoa, what'd I do? I turned it off. There it goes. Items from far and wide were crammed into Breton's small space, with a disorderly profusion of masks from Africa and sculptures from Oceania, together with natural history specimens of rocks and crystals. Here, too, we have an attempt to manifest the theater of the world in a single room, although Breton and the Surrealists added a psychological dimension found at once in themselves and in the materials they collected. Like the grand curiosity cabinets we saw earlier, Breton even had an elaborate antique Spanish cabinet topped by a glass globe filled with stuffed birds, reminiscent of the exotic stuffed birds so often found in earlier curiosity cabinets. In fact, Breton exhibited the cabinet and bird vitrine with added arms and legs in the same International Exposition of Surrealist Art in Paris that included Cornell's sewing machine collage. And both were illustrated in an accompanying book that Cornell could easily have seen. with a witty play on the cabinet's legs and a nod to an earlier tradition of religious reliquaries, Breton's surrealist cabinet combines naturalia and artificialia in ways reminiscent of former curiosity cabinets. In particular, Breton seems to have drawn on the apparent illogic of the hybrid couplings of marvelous natural objects with man-made ones that so fascinated earlier collectors. And you can see many of these down in the Kunstkammer. We can see it here in this example if we look at the top of the cabinet and look at the coconut and coral cup together with silver decoration. That is the hat that this cabinet seems to wear. We also see it in the fantastic ostrich egg and coral goblet in the Kunstkammer downstairs, which reminds me of a kind of assisted ready-made before Marcel Duchamp arrived on the scene. In Breton's transmutation of objects, we find a conscious move away from the unity and logic that marked modern scientific thought, and a return to what in Breton's time was considered the illogic of wonder that fueled the age of discovery. Indeed, if we look at these materials from the exhibition of surrealist objects held at the Charles Raton Gallery in 1936, the list of items could be a checklist for a curiosity cabinet. Mathematical objects, savage objects from America and Oceania, natural objects, found objects, ready-made and interpreted objects, all fit into Breton's category of the marvelous, which he codified in 1924 when he wrote, "The marvelous is always beautiful. Anything marvelous is beautiful. In fact, only the marvelous is beautiful." Although Cornell never visited Paris and did not see these exhibitions or Breton's apartment in person, he could have known them through descriptions from friends like Julien Levy and Duchamp. Cornell shared Breton's fascination for collecting and realized the power of the object to evoke a sense of strangeness, disorientation, or to use Cornell's term, unfoldment. So what can we conclude about Cornell's relationship to the Cabinet of Curiosities? I think it's safe to say that the things that fascinated earlier collectors of the riches of the New World were the same things that fascinated Cornell. The notion of containing a universe in microcosm appealed as much to Cornell as it did to early collectors. Both lived in great ages of discovery, when their universe was expanding beyond their imaginations. But Cornell also had the added advantage of a more modern tradition of organization and classification that led to the establishment of natural history museums and modes of display that resonated with his own. And finally, Cornell was clearly attuned to the creative potential inherent in the rebellion against scientific logic led by surrealist artists and writers in the 1920s and 30s, the decades when Cornell came of artistic age. Cornell had only the tiniest of introductions to actual curiosity cabinets, but he shared the same sensibility of wanting to contain the universe in a box through symbolic objects representative of the wonders of the world and the fruits of exploration and discovery. If, as James Fenton writes, Cornell, quote, resurrected the spirit of the Wunderkammer while eliminating all of its intellectual basis, chucking out its meaning in order to allow new meanings to flow in, unquote, then just what were those new meanings? For Cornell, the box format offered a way to contain the wonders of existence, from personal memories and unfulfilled desires to grand theories about our place in the universe. In his work, he presented metaphors for what mattered to him, from tiny grains of sand to the vast reaches of the heavens, as testaments to his belief in the significance and creative power of collecting and containing the sublime ethereality of wonder. Thank you.